The music had not even started, and already Alara Whitmore's hands were shaking. She stood at the edge of the ballroom of Ashford Manor, gripping the folds of her borrowed gown, watching hundreds of candles throw gold light across marble floors polished to a mirror shine. Every face in that room belonged to someone with a title, a fortune, or both. She had neither. She had a patched hem hidden under a layer of blue silk that her aunt had let out at the seams the night before, and she had a father standing 3 feet away from her, straightening his collar and smiling at anyone who might be useful to him. Baron Edwin Whitmore had not brought his daughter to Ashford Manor because he loved her company. He had brought her because a man named Percival Kent, a shipping merchant with more money than manners, would be at the ball, and Edwin Whitmore needed a favor from him. Alara was there to be seen, to smile politely, and to give her father an excuse to strike up a conversation near the refreshment table. She understood this. She had understood it for years. It did not make the candlelight feel any warmer. "Stand up straight," her father muttered without looking at her. "And for heaven's sake, stop fidgeting with your dress. You look like a girl who has never been indoors before." Alara let her hands fall still. She had learned long ago that arguing with her father in public cost more than it was worth. She simply nodded and looked out over the crowd, searching for a friendly face, and found none. She recognized no one here except by reputation, and reputation, she had learned, rarely matched the person standing in front of you. Then the room shifted. A ripple of attention moved through the crowd the way wind moves through wheat, and Alara turned to see what had caused it. He walked in from a side hallway, tall, dark-haired, dressed in a black coat that fit him as though it had been sewn onto his shoulders. He did not smile. He did not need to. Every eye in the room had already found him before he took 3 steps into the ballroom. "That," whispered a woman near Alara, fanning herself rapidly, "is the Duke." Alara did not need the introduction. She had heard his name whispered in every drawing room she had visited in the past month. Rhys Ashford, Duke of Ashford, 29 years old, unmarried, cold as winter stone according to every rumor that had ever reached her ears, and richer than any man she had ever stood in the same room with. He crossed the floor with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never once in his life worried about being unwelcome anywhere. Guests bowed, guests curtsied, guests angled themselves subtly in his direction, hoping to be noticed, hoping for a nod, a word, anything. Alara had no intention of being one of them. She had learned, from years of watching her father chase favors from men like this, that hope directed at powerful strangers rarely returned anything worth having. But her father had other plans. "Alara," his voice was low, urgent, close to her ear, "the Duke is unmarried. Do you understand what I am telling you? If you could catch his eye tonight, even for a moment, our family's fortunes could change overnight." "Father, I don't think." "You don't need to think. You need to walk toward him and curtsy the way I taught you. That is all. Can you manage that much?" Alara's stomach turned cold. She had watched her father maneuver her like a chess piece before, but never toward someone so far above their station that the very idea felt absurd. "Father, he will not even look at me." "Then make him look." There was no arguing with that tone. Alara had tried in the past, and it had never gone well for her. So she smoothed the front of her borrowed gown, lifted her chin the way her mother used to teach her before she died, and walked across the ballroom floor toward the one man in the room that everyone else seemed too afraid to approach directly. Conversations paused as she passed. She felt the weight of stares on her shoulders, curious, amused, some faintly pitying, as though they already knew how this would end and found the anticipation entertaining. She kept walking anyway. Turning back now would be worse than whatever waited ahead. The Duke was speaking with 2 older gentlemen when she reached the edge of his circle. She waited, the way she had been taught, for a pause in conversation. When it came, she stepped forward and dropped into a careful curtsy. "Your Grace," her voice came out steadier than she expected, "would you do me the honor of a dance?" The words hung in the air. For a moment nothing happened. The Duke did not answer immediately. He looked at her the way a man might look at an unfamiliar insect that had landed uninvited on his sleeve, taking in every detail with a slow, assessing gaze that made Alara's skin prickle with heat. He looked at her dress, the hem she had thought no one would notice. He looked at her shoes, which had been resoled twice. He looked, finally, at her face, and something in his expression made her wish more than anything that she had never crossed the room at all. "Worthy," he said, as though tasting the word before deciding it did not apply to her, "is not a word I would use to describe you, Miss Whitmore," she managed. "Miss Whitmore." He said her name the way one might name a disease. "I dance with women whose families have stood beside mine for generations. I do not know your family. I do not know your name until this very moment. And judging by the state of your gown, I suspect you do not belong in this room at all, let alone on this floor with me." The nearby conversation had died completely. Every ear within 20 feet had turned toward them, drawn by the sudden silence the way animals are drawn to the scent of blood in water. Alara felt her face burn, felt her carefully composed posture begin to crumble, felt the eyes of 100 strangers settle on her like physical weight pressing down on her shoulders. And then from somewhere behind her, she heard laughter. Her father's laughter. She turned, disbelieving, and found him standing exactly where she had left him, laughing along with a small cluster of men who had gathered to watch the humiliation unfold, his face red with amusement rather than anger, rather than any flicker of protection for his own daughter. He caught her eye across the room and gave a small, helpless shrug, as if to say, "Well, what did you expect?" before turning back to share another laugh with the man beside him. Something inside Alara went very quiet and very still. She did not cry. She refused to give either of them, her father or the Duke, the satisfaction of watching her fall apart in the middle of a ballroom. Instead, she straightened her spine, the way her mother had taught her to do when the world tried to make her small, and she looked directly into the Duke's cold gray eyes. "Thank you for your honesty, Your Grace," she said, her voice carrying further than she intended, loud enough that several nearby guests turned their heads in surprise. "It has taught me a great deal about the value of a title tonight. I hope it brings you comfort, knowing exactly who you are." She did not wait to see his reaction. She turned on her heel and walked away, her chin still lifted, her steps measured and unhurried despite the storm raging behind her ribs. She walked past her father without stopping, past the men still chuckling over what they had witnessed, past the woman who had first pointed the Duke out to her, and out through the tall glass doors that led to the manor's gardens. The night air hit her like cold water, and only then, hidden by darkness and the tall hedges lining the garden path, did she allow her hands to shake again. She walked further than she meant to, past fountains and rows of white roses turned silver by moonlight, until the sound of the ball faded into a distant hum of music and laughter that no longer belonged to her. She found a stone bench beneath an old oak tree and sat down, wrapping her arms around herself against the chill. "Rough evening." The voice startled her. She looked up to find a man standing a short distance away, dressed simply, a lantern hanging from one hand, dirt still visible along the edge of his sleeves. He was not a guest. His clothes made that plain enough, along with the pruning shears tucked into his belt. "I'm sorry," Alara said quickly, rising from the bench. "I didn't mean to intrude. I'll go back." "You're not intruding on anything," the man said, setting the lantern down on the edge of the fountain nearby. "This garden belongs to whoever needs it most on a given night, in my opinion, and it looks like tonight that's you." Alara studied him for a moment, uncertain whether to trust the kindness in his voice after the evening she had just endured. "Are you one of the groundskeepers?" "Combe," he said, offering a small, easy smile. "I look after these gardens mostly. Roses mostly hate me, but the oaks seem to tolerate my company." He nodded toward the manor behind them, where golden light spilled from every window. "You looked like you needed somewhere quiet. I wasn't going to say anything, but you looked like you might also need someone to say something kind, even if it's just from a stranger who trims hedges for a living." Despite everything, despite the humiliation still burning in her chest, Alara felt the corner of her mouth lift just slightly. That's a strange kind of kindness, Colm. Strange kindness is still kindness, he said, settling onto the low stone wall a respectful distance from her. Besides, I've worked in that house long enough to know the sort of things that happen in ballrooms like that one. People say cruel things because it makes them feel important, and other people laugh because they're too afraid to do anything else. Doesn't mean either of them are right. Alara wrapped her arms tighter around herself, surprised by how much his words settled the storm inside her, if only a little. You heard then. Word travels fast in a house full of servants, Colm admitted. Faster than anywhere else, honestly. But for what it's worth, from what I've heard about the man in question, he's not exactly known for warmth. There are stories about him that would make tonight look gentle by comparison. What kind of stories? Colm hesitated, glancing back toward the manor as though the walls themselves might be listening. Not my place to gossip about my employer, miss, but I'll say this much. A man who was raised the way he was raised doesn't come out the other side without scars, even if you can't see them from where you're standing. Doesn't excuse what he said to you tonight. Nothing excuses that. But there's more to that house than pretty windows and expensive candles. Alara considered this in silence, watching the distant lights of the ballroom flicker through the trees like something from another world entirely, a world she had briefly stepped into and had been firmly, publicly shown that she did not belong in. She thought of her father's laughter, the way it had cut deeper than anything the Duke had said, because her father was supposed to be the one person in that room who stood beside her no matter what. I should get back, she said finally, though she made no move to stand. My father will be looking for me, or perhaps he won't. Perhaps he's still laughing. Something in her voice must have given away more than she intended, because Colm's easy expression softened into something closer to concern. Family's supposed to be the one thing you can count on, isn't it? Shame when it turns out not to be. Shame, Alara repeated quietly, testing the word. It felt like the truest thing anyone had said to her all evening. She sat with Colm in the quiet garden a while longer, neither of them speaking much, simply letting the night settle around them like a blanket pulled over the worst parts of the evening. Eventually, she rose, thanked him for his company, and made her way back toward the front of the manor, choosing the long path around the hedges rather than walking back through the ballroom itself. She could not bear the thought of facing those eyes again tonight, of walking past the spot where the Duke had looked at her like something unwanted scraped from the bottom of his shoe. Her father found his own way home hours later, well after midnight, smelling faintly of brandy and satisfaction, having apparently secured at least a promise of conversation from Percival Kent despite, or perhaps because of, the spectacle his daughter had made of herself. You handled that poorly, he told her the next morning over a breakfast neither of them touched with any real appetite. A little grace would have served you better than that sharp tongue of yours. Alara said nothing. She had learned over many years that there was no version of this conversation that ended with her father seeing her clearly, seeing the daughter standing in front of him rather than the pawn he needed her to be. So she simply nodded, excused herself from the table, and returned to her room, where she sat by the window and watched the gray morning light creep slowly across the floor. She did not yet know that the events of that single evening, the cruel words spoken in a crowded ballroom, her father's careless laughter, the quiet kindness of a stranger in a garden, would set into motion a chain of events that would change the direction of her entire life. She only knew, sitting there in the cold morning light, that something inside her had shifted overnight, hardened into something she had not possessed before walking into that ballroom. She was done being small. She was done letting other people decide what she was worth. Whatever came next, she promised herself she would meet it standing. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, and by Wednesday, everything Alara Whitmore thought she understood about her life had collapsed like a house built on sand. She found her father in his study before dawn, sitting in the dark with an unlit candle beside him, and a stack of papers scattered across his desk like the aftermath of a small war. His face, when he finally looked up at her, had aged 10 years overnight. "Father, what's happened?" "Sit down, Alara." She had never heard that particular tone from him before, flat and hollow, stripped of the confidence that usually carried every word out of his mouth. She sat. "The shipping venture with Kent has failed," he said, staring at a point on the desk rather than at her face. "2 of our vessels went down off the coast last month. We only received word yesterday. The insurance will cover almost nothing, and the debts we took on to fund the venture." He trailed off, pressing his palms flat against his eyes. "We are ruined, Alara, completely ruined." The word hung in the cold study air between them. Alara had grown up hearing her father speak of money the way other men spoke of weather, an ever-present concern but rarely a true crisis. To hear him say ruined and mean it frightened her more than she wanted to admit. "What does that mean for us?" she asked carefully. "For the house, for—" "It means everything is at risk. The house, what remains of your mother's jewelry, everything." He finally looked at her, and something in his expression made her stomach drop before he even spoke again. "Unless we find another way." Alara felt the shape of what was coming before he said it, the way one feels the chill of a coming storm before the first cloud appears on the horizon. "There is a man," her father continued, choosing his words with obvious care, "named Edmund Voss, a merchant. Older, yes, and not the most charming company, I will admit that freely. But he has expressed interest in a marriage arrangement, and the dowry he is offering would settle every debt we owe within the month." "Father," Alara's voice came out sharper than she intended, "you cannot mean to sell me to a stranger to cover your debts." "I would not phrase it so crudely," he snapped, some of his usual fire returning to his voice now that the true purpose of the conversation had surfaced. "It is a marriage, not a transaction. Women marry for practical reasons every day of the week in every corner of this country. You would want for nothing. Voss is wealthy enough to provide any comfort you desire." "Any comfort except my own choice in the matter." Her father's expression hardened. "Do you think I have a choice, Alara? Do you think I enjoy sitting in this study, watching the roof I inherited from my own father slip through my fingers because 2 ships sank in a storm? I have exhausted every other option. This is the only path left that does not end with both of us in the poorhouse." "Then find another path," Alara said, rising from her chair, her hands trembling not from fear now but from something closer to fury. "I will not marry a man I have never met simply because you gambled our family's future on ships and lost. You will do as you are told." Her father stood as well, his voice rising to fill the study. "I am still your father, and this is still my house, for however much longer that remains true." "Then perhaps," Alara said, her voice suddenly, dangerously calm, "you should have remembered that before you laughed at me in front of an entire ballroom." The words landed like a slap. Her father's face went pale, then red, and for a moment Alara thought he might strike her, something he had never once done in her entire life, no matter how many arguments they had endured. Instead, he turned away, gripping the edge of his desk until his knuckles went white. "Go to your room," he said, his voice low and unsteady. "We will discuss this further when you have calmed yourself." Alara did not move immediately. She stood in the doorway of that cold study, looking at the man who had raised her, who had once, long ago before her mother died, carried her on his shoulders through the orchard behind their old house and called her his brightest star. She searched his face for some trace of that man now, and found only exhaustion, fear, and the particular selfishness of a man who had run out of better ideas. "I will not marry Edmund Voss," she said quietly. "Whatever else happens to this family, I will not do that." She left the study without waiting for a response and climbed the stairs to her room, where she sat on the edge of her bed for a long time, staring at nothing, trying to make sense of the ground shifting so violently beneath her feet. Over the following days, the full weight of her family's situation became impossible to ignore. Creditors began arriving at their door with increasing frequency, polite at first, then less so as the days passed without payment. Furniture disappeared from rooms she had grown up in, sold quietly to settle small debts before larger ones could be addressed. Her father grew thinner, more withdrawn, spending long hours locked in his study with bottles that emptied faster than any solution ever appeared. Edmund Voss came to call twice during that difficult stretch of weeks. Alara met him both times with careful, practiced politeness, and both times she came away from the encounter with a cold, uneasy feeling settled deep in her stomach. He was not an unhandsome man, not exactly, but there was something in the way he looked at her, appraising and possessive at once, as though he had already begun counting the ways she would belong to him once the arrangement was finalized. He spoke of her as though she were a fine piece of furniture he intended to purchase, discussing her qualities with her father as if she were not sitting in the very same room. "She has good posture," he remarked during his second visit, addressing her father directly while Alara sat rigid in her chair, "and a pleasant enough face. She'll do well enough once she learns to keep her opinions to herself." Alara's fingers curled into fists in her lap, but she said nothing, aware that any outburst now would only strengthen her father's resolve to see the marriage through. She had learned in the days since the study conversation that fighting her father directly accomplished nothing. She needed a different strategy entirely. That strategy began to take shape on a rainy afternoon nearly 2 weeks later, when Alara overheard her aunt, her mother's younger sister, speaking with a family friend in the parlor about a position that had recently opened in a wealthy household several miles outside the city. "The Fairweathers are looking for a companion and tutor for their younger children," her aunt was saying. "Someone educated, someone who can manage both lessons and manners. They pay well, from what I understand, and the position comes with lodging." Alara stood outside the parlor door, her heart beginning to beat faster with something she had not felt in weeks: hope. She waited until her aunt's friend had left before entering the parlor, finding her aunt seated near the window with a cup of tea slowly going cold in her hands. Margaret Whitmore, unlike her brother, had never approved of using Alara as a bargaining chip in matters of business or marriage, and the two women shared a closeness that had only deepened since Alara's mother had passed. "Aunt Margaret," Alara said, closing the door behind her, "tell me about this position with the Fairweathers." Her aunt studied her for a long moment, understanding immediately what her niece intended. "Alara, your father would never allow it, especially not now with the Voss arrangement hanging over this house." "My father does not need to know until it is already done," Alara said, sitting across from her aunt with a new determination steadying her voice. "I will not marry Edmund Voss, Aunt Margaret. I have made that decision, and nothing my father says will change it. But I need somewhere to go, some way to support myself, before he forces the issue entirely." Her aunt was quiet for a long moment, turning her teacup slowly in her hands. "You understand what you would be giving up. No family name to protect you out there. No comfortable house to return to if things go poorly. You would be entirely on your own, answering to strangers, earning your keep through your own labor rather than through any inheritance." "I understand," Alara said, and found, to her own surprise, that the prospect did not frighten her nearly as much as it should have. After weeks of watching her father's desperation reshape her entire future without her consent, the idea of standing entirely on her own 2 feet felt less like a danger and more like the first breath of fresh air she had taken in a very long time. "Then I will write to Lady Fairweather on your behalf," her aunt said finally, setting down her teacup with quiet resolve. "She and I were acquainted years ago, before your mother passed. I believe she will remember me kindly enough to consider you for the position, especially if I vouch for your character and your education." Over the following week, arrangements moved forward in careful secrecy. Letters passed between Aunt Margaret and Lady Fairweather, discussing Alara's qualifications, her education in languages and music, her experience managing the household accounts during the years her father had proven too distracted or too absent to manage them himself. Lady Fairweather, it turned out, was in genuine need of someone capable and discreet, someone who could manage two lively children while also serving, on occasion, as a companion for her own social engagements. The position seemed, in every practical sense, to fit Alara perfectly. The difficult part remained telling her father. She chose a quiet evening for the conversation, waiting until the house had settled and the worst of his frustrations from the day had faded into the low simmer that had become his usual temperament. She found him in the study again, though this time the candle beside him burned steady and bright. "Father, I need to speak with you." He looked up, wary, as though bracing himself for another argument about Edmund Voss. "If this is about the marriage again, Alara, I have already made my position clear." "It is not about the marriage," she said, standing straight, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "I have accepted a position as a companion and tutor for the Fairweather family. I begin in 1 week's time." Her father stared at her as though she had spoken in a foreign language. "You have done what?" "I will not marry Edmund Voss," Alara said again, the words coming easier this time, strengthened by weeks of quiet preparation. "I understand our family is in a difficult position, and I am sorry for that truly. But I will not sacrifice the rest of my life to solve a problem I did not create. I have found honest work that will allow me to support myself, and I intend to take it." For a long moment, her father said nothing at all. She watched a dozen different emotions cross his face, anger and disbelief chief among them, but beneath those, something she had not expected to see. A flicker of something that might have been shame or perhaps, buried very deep, a grudging respect for the resolve she had shown. "You would abandon this family," he said finally, though the fire had gone out of his voice, "for a position as a servant in someone else's house." "I would rather be a servant with my own dignity intact," Alara said quietly, "than a wife bought and sold to settle a debt. I am sorry it has come to this, father. But I have made my decision, and I will not be moved from it." She left the study that night without waiting for his response, and though he raged for 2 full days afterward, threatening to forbid the arrangement entirely, refusing to speak to her at meals, the truth remained unchanged beneath all his anger. Without Alara's cooperation, the Voss marriage could not proceed, and without that marriage, her father had no other solution to his mounting debts. In the end, exhausted by his own fury and unable to find any leverage that might change her mind, he relented. Though he made his disapproval known in every cold, clipped word he offered her in the days leading up to her departure. On the morning she left, her father did not come to see her off. Only Aunt Margaret stood in the doorway of the house that had raised her, tears standing in her eyes as she embraced her niece one final time. "Write to me," her aunt said, holding Alara's face gently between her hands. "Every week if you can manage it. And Alara, whatever you find in that house, whatever new life waits for you there, do not let it make you smaller. You have fought too hard already to become anything less than exactly who you are." Alara promised she would, climbed into the small carriage that would carry her toward the Fairweather estate and the life waiting on the other side of it, and did not look back at the house behind her, not once, as the wheels began to turn and the road stretched out ahead into a future she had chosen for herself, for the very first time in her life. The Fairweather estate rose out of the countryside like something from a painting, all pale stone and ivy-covered walls, with gardens that stretched further than Alara could see from the carriage window. It was smaller than Ashford Manor, less grand in its ambition, but it carried a warmth about it that the Duke's house had entirely lacked, even from a distance, even before she had stepped through its doors. Lady Fairweather herself met the carriage at the front steps, a tall woman with kind eyes and prematurely silver hair pulled back in a simple style that suggested she had little patience for excessive fashion. She looked Alara over with a brief, practical assessment, nothing like the cold appraisal Alara had endured at the ball weeks earlier, and extended a genuinely warm hand in greeting. "Miss Whitmore, Margaret speaks very highly of you. I do hope the journey wasn't too tiring." Not at all, my lady. Thank you for the opportunity. Save your gratitude until you've met the children, Lady Fairweather said with a small, wry smile. Grace and Oliver have exhausted 3 governesses in the past 2 years alone. I confess I am hoping you might last longer than a season. Elara felt a genuine laugh escape her, the first real one in what felt like months. I will do my very best, my lady. That's all any of us can promise. Lady Fairweather gestured toward the house. Come inside. Let's get you settled before you meet your new charges. They can be a bit overwhelming on first introduction. The house, as Elara soon discovered, ran with an easy warmth that stood in sharp contrast to the cold formality she had experienced in her father's household during those final difficult weeks. The staff greeted her without suspicion or judgment, treating her as a welcome addition rather than an outsider to be tolerated. Her room, tucked into the east wing near the children's nursery, was small but comfortable, with a window that looked out over a wide expanse of rolling green hills. Grace, 9 years old with an endless supply of questions, and Oliver, 7 and prone to climbing anything that could conceivably be climbed, proved to be a handful in exactly the way Lady Fairweather had warned. But Elara found herself unexpectedly delighted by their energy rather than exhausted by it. Within the first week, she had established a rhythm of lessons in the mornings, walks and games in the afternoons, and quiet reading before bed that both children, despite their initial testing of her patience, began to genuinely look forward to. You're different from the others, Grace informed her one afternoon, several weeks into Elara's residence, as they sat together in the garden identifying flowers for a botany lesson. The last governess used to cry when Oliver put frogs in her shoes. You just put the frog back outside and kept teaching. Crying over frogs seems like a waste of good tears, Elara said, examining a cluster of blue flowers with mock seriousness. There are far better things to cry about, if one must cry at all. Like what? Elara considered the question longer than she meant to, memories of a ballroom and a cold voice surfacing unbidden. Like disappointment, she said finally, or unkindness, but even those things pass eventually if you let them. Grace seemed to accept this answer with the easy acceptance of childhood, and moved on to identifying the next flower. But the moment lingered with Elara longer than she expected, a reminder that despite the new rhythm of her days, despite the genuine comfort she had begun to find within the Fairweather household, the events of that terrible evening at Ashford Manor had not entirely left her. She learned over the following weeks that the Fairweathers moved in the same social circles as the Ashford family, though their own fortune, while comfortable, fell well short of the Duke's staggering wealth. Lord Fairweather, a genial man with a fondness for horses and an obvious devotion to his wife and children, occasionally mentioned business dealings that touched, at least peripherally, on the Ashford estate. Elara learned to keep her expression neutral whenever the family name arose in conversation, though something cold and unpleasant twisted in her stomach each time she heard it. The Duke is hosting again next month, Lady Fairweather mentioned one evening at dinner, addressing her husband while Elara sat quietly at the far end of the table, having been invited on this occasion to join the family meal rather than eat separately with the staff. A smaller gathering this time, I understand. Business matters mostly, though I imagine there will be some social element as well. Ashford throws a decent enough gathering, Lord Fairweather agreed, cutting into his meal without much apparent interest in the topic. Cold company, though. Never understood how a man raised with every advantage in the world grew into someone so guarded. Elara kept her eyes on her plate, saying nothing, though she felt Lady Fairweather's gaze flicker toward her briefly, curious perhaps at her sudden silence, but too polite to press the matter at the dinner table. Later that evening, after the children had been put to bed, and the house had settled into its quiet nighttime rhythm, Lady Fairweather found Elara in the small library, sorting through books for the following day's lessons. You went very quiet at dinner, Lady Fairweather observed, settling into a chair near the fireplace. When the Duke's name came up, Alara considered denying it, then decided against the dishonesty. Lady Fairweather had shown her nothing but kindness since her arrival, and something in the older woman's manner suggested she was not the type to gossip carelessly with what she learned. "I met him once," Alara admitted. "At a ball some months ago. It did not go particularly well." "Ah," Lady Fairweather's expression softened with understanding rather than curiosity. "He has something of a reputation for that sort of thing, I'm afraid. Cutting people down without much apparent thought for the consequences. I've heard stories from more than one young woman who came away from an encounter with him feeling considerably smaller than when they arrived." "Why is he like that?" Alara asked, the question slipping out before she could reconsider it. "If you don't mind my asking." Lady Fairweather was quiet for a moment, considering how much to share. "His father was a difficult man, from what I understand, demanding and cold, more concerned with the family's standing than with raising a son who might actually be happy. His mother passed when he was still quite young, and there was some scandal involving his younger sister some years back, though the details were always kept carefully quiet. I believe he inherited the title far younger than anyone expected, and with it, a great deal of responsibility that might have hardened a gentler man as well." She shook her head slightly. "It doesn't excuse cruelty, of course. Nothing excuses that. But there is usually more beneath the surface of a man like that than the surface itself reveals." Alara turned this information over in her mind long after Lady Fairweather had retired for the evening, sitting alone in the quiet library with a book open in her lap that she made no real effort to read. She thought of Comb's words in the garden, the hints of a difficult past hiding behind the Duke's cold exterior, and found herself, despite every reason not to, curious about the man who had humiliated her so thoroughly in front of an entire ballroom. She told herself the curiosity meant nothing. She had built a new life for herself here, a life with purpose and dignity that had nothing to do with dukes or ballrooms or the approval of men who judged worth by the cut of a woman's dress. She intended to keep it that way. But fate, as it turned out, had other plans entirely. 3 weeks later, an invitation arrived at the Fairweather estate, embossed with the Ashford family crest, inviting Lord and Lady Fairweather, along with their household, to a small gathering at Ashford Manor intended to discuss a business partnership between the two families involving new investments in shipping routes along the southern coast. Lady Fairweather, aware that Alara would need to accompany the children if the visit extended into the evening hours, broached the subject carefully over breakfast the following morning. "I understand if you would rather not attend," she said gently, watching Alara's reaction closely, "given your history with the family. I can make other arrangements for the children if it would be easier." Alara sat with the invitation in her hands for a long moment, feeling old wounds stir beneath a surface she had worked hard to smooth over in the weeks since her arrival. Every instinct told her to decline, to avoid any possibility of standing in that ballroom again, of facing that cold gray gaze and the memory of her father's laughter echoing through her mind. But beneath that instinct, something else stirred as well, something steadier and more defiant. She had left her father's house rather than let anyone else dictate the shape of her life. She had built something of her own here, a position she had earned through her own effort rather than inherited or been given. The thought of avoiding Ashford Manor out of fear, of letting one cruel evening continue to dictate her choices months later, sat poorly with the person she had been slowly becoming since her arrival at the Fairweather estate. "I will attend," she said finally, setting the invitation down with a steadiness that surprised even herself. "I am no longer the same woman who walked into that ballroom last time, my lady. I have nothing left to fear from him." Lady Fairweather studied her for a long moment, something like quiet approval settling across her features. "Good," she said simply. "It's about time someone stood their ground with that family. Perhaps it will do the Duke some good to see it." Alara spent the following days preparing for the visit with a focus and determination that surprised the household staff, who had grown accustomed to her steady, unflappable presence over the preceding weeks. She continued her lessons with Grace and Oliver without interruption, maintained her usual careful attention to the household's daily rhythms, and gave no outward indication of the storm of memory and anticipation building beneath her calm exterior. On the morning of the visit, she dressed with quiet deliberation, choosing a simple gown of deep green that Lady Fairweather had gifted her weeks earlier, well made and elegant without excess, nothing borrowed or altered this time, nothing that marked her as an outsider trying too hard to belong somewhere she had not been invited. She looked at herself in the small mirror in her room and saw, for the first time in longer than she could remember, someone who looked entirely comfortable in her own skin. "You look ready for anything," Grace observed, watching from the doorway with the frank honesty children so often possessed. "Are you nervous?" "A little," Elara admitted, turning to smile at her young charge. "But nervous doesn't mean afraid, Grace. Remember that. You can feel nervous about something and still walk forward anyway." "Is that what you're doing today, walking forward anyway?" "Yes," Elara said, taking the girl's hand as they made their way toward the carriage waiting outside. "That is exactly what I am doing." As the carriage began its long journey toward Ashford Manor, winding through countryside, Elara had once traveled in the opposite direction, fleeing an entirely different kind of humiliation. She found herself thinking not of the cruel words spoken to her months earlier, but of the woman she had become since then. She thought of the children asleep upstairs in a house that had welcomed her without judgment, of Lady Fairweather's quiet kindness, of the steady rhythm of a life built entirely on her own terms rather than inherited from a father who had valued her only as a means to an end. Whatever waited for her at Ashford Manor this time, she told herself, watching the familiar spires of the great house rise slowly into view on the horizon, she would meet it as exactly who she had become, not as the frightened girl who had once begged for a single dance and received only cruelty in return. She was, for perhaps the first time in her entire life, entirely unafraid of what came next. The carriage rolled to a stop in front of Ashford Manor just as the last light of afternoon began to soften into evening gold, and Elara stepped down onto the same gravel drive she had once crossed in humiliation, feeling nothing now but a steady, quiet resolve settling into her bones. Lord and Lady Fairweather went ahead into the main hall to greet their host, while Elara remained behind briefly to see to Grace and Oliver, who had been invited to spend the evening in the nursery wing under the supervision of the household's own governess, while the adults attended to matters of business. She settled the children with their temporary caretaker, exchanged a few words of instruction, and then made her way through the grand corridors of Ashford Manor alone, following the sound of voices toward the main receiving room where the small gathering had begun to assemble. She did not expect to encounter the Duke himself in the hallway. He rounded a corner just as she reached it, dressed far more simply than she remembered from the ball, his dark coat unbuttoned, his expression distracted, clearly preoccupied with whatever business matter awaited him in the receiving room ahead. He nearly walked directly into her before either of them registered the other's presence, and when he finally looked up, really looked at her, something shifted across his face that Elara could not immediately identify. Recognition, certainly, but beneath that, something closer to confusion, as though he could not quite place how the frightened young woman he had humiliated months earlier had come to be standing in his own hallway, dressed with quiet elegance, meeting his gaze without flinching. "Miss Whitmore." His voice carried none of the cold certainty she remembered from their first encounter. "I did not expect to see you here." "I imagine not, Your Grace." Elara kept her voice level, polite, entirely devoid of the tremor that had betrayed her the last time they stood this close to one another. "I am currently employed as companion and tutor to the Fairweather children. I accompanied them this evening." Something flickered across his expression, surprise perhaps, or the faint beginnings of an emotion he did not seem entirely comfortable displaying. "Employed," he repeated, as though the word did not quite fit with whatever assumptions he had carried about her since their last meeting. Yes, Alara held his gaze steadily. Circumstances change, Your Grace. People change with them, when they're given the opportunity to. He said nothing for a long moment, studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away, though she refused to give him the satisfaction. She could see him searching for something to say, some way to navigate a conversation he had clearly not anticipated having, and found, to her quiet surprise, that watching him struggle for words offered her a small measure of satisfaction she had not expected to feel. "I owe you an apology," he said finally, the words coming out stiff and unpracticed, as though apology were a language he rarely had occasion to speak, "for what I said to you at the ball. It was unkind and unnecessary, and I have thought of it more than once since that evening." Alara studied him carefully, weighing the sincerity of the words against the memory of his cruelty, against the sound of her father's laughter that still occasionally surfaced in her quieter moments. "Have you?" she said, neither confirming nor denying whether she believed him. "That's a curious thing to think of more than once, for a man who declared me unworthy of a single dance." Something like genuine discomfort crossed his features. It was a poor choice of words. "It was cruel," Alara corrected, her voice steady but firm. "There is a difference between a poor choice of words and deliberate cruelty spoken loudly enough for an entire ballroom to hear, Your Grace. I would ask that you not mistake the two, even now." For a moment, she thought he might respond with the same cold arrogance she remembered from their first meeting, might retreat into the defensive dismissiveness that seemed to come so naturally to men of his station when confronted with an inconvenient truth. Instead, something in his expression softened, and he inclined his head slightly in what might have been the beginnings of genuine acknowledgement. "You're right," he said quietly, "it was cruel. I have no defense to offer for it, except to say that I have carried more discomfort over that evening than I expected to, and I am glad, strange as it may sound, to have the opportunity to tell you so directly." Alara did not know quite what to make of this unexpected turn, this glimpse of something almost human beneath the cold exterior she had built her entire impression of him around. She remembered Combs' words in the garden, Lady Fairweather's mention of a difficult father and a buried family scandal, and found herself, despite every reasonable instinct, curious about the man standing in front of her now. "I accept your apology, Your Grace," she said finally, choosing her words with care, "though I will admit it does not entirely erase the memory of that evening. Some things linger, whether we wish them to or not." "I would not ask you to forget it," he said, "only, perhaps, to allow that I am capable of more than what you witnessed that night." Before Alara could respond, a voice called out from further down the corridor, one of the other guests summoning the Duke's attention toward the business discussion waiting to begin. He glanced toward the sound, then back at her, something reluctant in the way he lingered before finally stepping back. "I hope we might speak again this evening," he said, "if circumstances allow." "Perhaps," Alara said, offering nothing more definite than that single, careful word. He nodded, something almost like a genuine smile touching the corner of his mouth before he turned, and made his way toward the waiting business discussion, leaving Alara standing alone in the hallway, her heart beating faster than she wanted to admit, her carefully constructed composure shaken by an encounter she had not expected to unsettle her nearly as much as it had. She made her way toward the receiving room a few minutes later, finding Lady Fairweather engaged in polite conversation near the fireplace, and joining her with an outward calm that belied the confusion churning beneath the surface. The evening passed in a blur of business discussion she had little part in, of polite conversation among guests she barely knew, of stolen glances across the room that she told herself meant nothing at all, even as she found her attention drawn again and again toward the tall, dark-haired figure moving through his own house with far more restraint and consideration than she remembered from their first encounter. By the time the Fairweather carriage began its journey back toward home that evening, the children asleep against her shoulder, Alara found herself staring out the window at the passing darkness, turning the events of the evening over in her mind with a confusion she had not anticipated feeling. She had walked into Ashford Manor that afternoon entirely certain of who the Duke was, certain of the cold cruelty that defined him, certain that nothing he could say or do would ever soften the memory of that terrible evening months earlier. She left with something far less certain settling in her chest, a curiosity she had not invited and did not entirely welcome, about the man beneath the title, about the scars Lady Fairweather had hinted at, about the strange, unguarded moment in the hallway when he had looked at her not as an unworthy stranger to be dismissed, but as someone whose opinion of him genuinely seemed to matter. She did not know, as the carriage carried her back toward the quiet, steady life she had built for herself at the Fairweather estate, that this single unexpected encounter had already set in motion a slow, reluctant thaw that neither she nor the Duke fully understood yet, one that would test everything she believed about worth, about forgiveness, and about the walls people built around themselves to keep out the very things they needed most. Weeks passed before Alara saw the Duke again, weeks filled with the steady rhythm of lessons and games and quiet evenings at the Fairweather estate that gradually, if not entirely, settled the strange unease that single encounter in the hallway had left behind. She told herself more than once that whatever brief flicker of understanding had passed between them meant nothing beyond a single moment of unexpected honesty, and that her life, her carefully rebuilt life, had no room in it for a man whose cruelty had once cut her so deeply in front of an entire room of strangers. But fate, it seemed, had grown fond of placing the two of them in each other's path. The second meeting came at a garden party hosted by a mutual acquaintance of both families, an event Alara attended once again in her capacity as companion to Grace and Oliver, who had been invited to join the other children in a supervised afternoon of games, while the adults mingled beneath white canopies scattered across a wide, sunlit lawn. She had not expected the Duke to attend, given Lord Fairweather's earlier comment about his general reluctance for purely social gatherings, and felt a small jolt of surprise when she spotted him standing near the edge of the lawn, engaged in stiff conversation with an older gentleman she did not recognize. He noticed her almost immediately, his gaze finding hers across the crowded lawn with an ease that suggested he had, perhaps, been looking for her without quite admitting it to himself. He excused himself from his conversation a few minutes later and made his way toward where she stood near the edge of the children's games, watching Oliver attempt, unsuccessfully, to master a game of croquet. Miss Whitmore. His greeting carried none of the coldness she remembered from their first meeting, though a certain formal reserve still lingered in his manner. I did not expect to find you here. The Fairweathers rarely leave me behind when the children are invited somewhere, Alara said, keeping her tone light despite the sudden quickening of her pulse. I have become something of a permanent fixture at their social engagements. A fortunate arrangement for the Fairweathers, I imagine. He watched Oliver send his croquet ball wildly off course with a small, genuine smile that transformed his usually severe features into something far more approachable. He has a great deal of enthusiasm, if not much accuracy. He improves daily, Alara said, smiling despite herself. Though I confess his aim, with a croquet mallet remains a work in progress. They stood together for a while longer, watching the children's game unfold with a comfortable silence that surprised Alara more than she wanted to admit. She had expected, if she saw him again at all, a return to the stiff formality of their hallway conversation weeks earlier, the careful distance of two people navigating an uncomfortable history. Instead, she found herself relaxing into his company with an ease that felt almost dangerous, given everything she knew about who he had shown himself to be. "May I ask you something, Miss Whitmore?" he said eventually, his gaze still fixed on the children's game rather than on her, as though the distraction made the question easier to voice. "That evening at my ball. Why did you approach me at all? You must have known, given everything you'd likely heard about me, that the encounter was unlikely to go well." Alara considered the question carefully before answering. My father insisted, she admitted. He hoped that if I caught your attention, it might improve our family's standing, our prospects. I did not want to approach you, if I am honest, but I had little choice in the matter at the time. Something shifted in the Duke's expression, a flicker of understanding, perhaps, or genuine regret. I did not consider that possibility, he said quietly. That you might have been as unwilling a participant in that moment as I made you feel afterward. Does it change anything knowing that? It changes how I understand what happened, he said, finally turning to look at her directly. It does not excuse my behavior, nothing excuses that, but it helps me understand the shape of that evening more fully than I did before. Alara studied his face, searching for the calculation, the performance she half expected to find beneath his words, and found instead something that looked remarkably like genuine reflection. You spoke of family pressures once in passing, she said carefully. Lady Fairweather mentioned something similar about your father and difficulties in your household growing up. I do not mean to pry into matters that are not my business, Your Grace, but I find myself curious how a man raised with every advantage in the world came to speak so cruelly to a stranger who had done him no harm. He was quiet for a long moment, and Alara wondered if she had overstepped, if the fragile ease building between them would collapse under the weight of too direct a question. But when he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the defensive coldness she had braced herself for. My father was not a kind man, he said slowly. He believed weakness was the greatest sin a person could commit, and he defined weakness very broadly: tears, uncertainty, any softness at all. I learned very young that the safest way to move through the world was to give him nothing to criticize, which meant, in practice, becoming very good at appearing to need nothing and no one. He paused, watching the children's game with an unfocused gaze that suggested his thoughts had traveled somewhere far beyond the sunlit lawn in front of him. My mother died when I was 12. My younger sister, Lucy, struggled a great deal after that, and my father handled her grief the same way he handled everything else, with distance and disapproval rather than comfort. I inherited the title at 22 when he passed, and I inherited, along with it, every hard lesson he had spent 2 decades teaching me about the dangers of appearing vulnerable in front of anyone at all. Alara listened in silence, feeling something in her chest soften despite every instinct telling her to remain guarded. That sounds like a very lonely way to grow up. It was, he admitted, the honesty in his voice catching her off guard. Though I did not understand that until far too recently. I have spent my entire adult life building walls so thoroughly that I no longer noticed I was building them at all. It became simply how I existed in the world. Cold, because coldness kept people at a safe distance. Cruel occasionally, because cruelty ensured no one got close enough to disappoint me the way my father always disappointed me. He looked at her then, something raw and unguarded in his expression that she had not expected to see from him. That evening at the ball, I said what I said because it was easier than admitting I did not know how to simply be kind to a stranger who approached me with nothing but an honest request. I have thought of that failure more than I care to admit in the months since. The confession settled between them, heavier and more honest than Alara had expected from a man she had spent months believing incapable of genuine self-reflection. She thought of her own father, of his laughter echoing across that same ballroom, and felt an unexpected flicker of understanding pass between her own history and his, 2 people shaped by parents who had valued appearance and advantage over genuine care. My father laughed, she said quietly, surprising herself with the admission, when you humiliated me that evening. He stood there and laughed along with the crowd rather than defending me. I think in some ways that hurt more than anything you said. The Duke's expression shifted into something that looked almost like pain. I am sorry, he said, and this time the words carried none of the stiff formality of his earlier apology. Sorry that you experienced that at all, and sorrier still that I contributed to it. You did more than contribute, Alara said. though her voice had lost the sharp edge it carried the first time she confronted him about that evening. "But I understand, better than perhaps I would like to, how a difficult childhood can shape a person into someone they might not have chosen to become, given a kinder start." They stood together in comfortable silence for a while longer, watching Grace attempt to teach Oliver the proper way to hold a croquet mallet with the endless patience only an older sibling could summon. And Alara found herself, despite every reasonable objection her mind could construct, genuinely enjoying the Duke's quiet company for the first time since they had met. Over the following weeks, their paths continued to cross with a frequency that felt less like coincidence and more like deliberate effort on both their parts, though neither acknowledged this directly. He began attending social gatherings he had previously avoided, always finding his way, eventually, to wherever Alara stood with the Fairweather children. She found herself, in turn, looking forward to these encounters with a warmth she was reluctant to examine too closely, aware that whatever was building between them existed in dangerous territory, given the vast gulf that still separated a duke from a household companion with no fortune or title to her name. "You've grown quieter," Lady Fairweather observed one evening, several weeks into this pattern, as she and Alara sat together in the library after the children had gone to bed. "Since we began attending these gatherings more frequently. I don't think it's an unhappy quiet, but it is a thoughtful one." Alara hesitated, uncertain how much to share even with a woman who had shown her nothing but kindness. "The Duke and I have spoken several times," she admitted finally. "He has been different than I expected, given our first meeting." Lady Fairweather's expression grew thoughtful. "Alara, I would be a poor friend if I did not say this plainly. Whatever understanding is building between the two of you, and I have noticed it, make no mistake, it exists across a distance that society will not easily forgive. A duke and a household companion. There will be those who see that gap and decide it cannot, should not be crossed, regardless of what either of you might feel." "I know," Alara said quietly. "I have thought of little else, honestly, since our conversations began. But there is something in him, Lady Fairweather, something genuine beneath everything I first believed about him, that I find myself unwilling to simply dismiss because the distance between us is inconvenient." "Then be careful," Lady Fairweather said, though her tone carried more concern than disapproval. "Not because I doubt your judgment, but because I have seen how cruelly the world treats women who reach for something above their station, even when their reasons for reaching are entirely honest. I would not want to see you hurt again, especially not by the same man who hurt you once already." Alara considered her friend's warning carefully in the days that followed, weighing it against the growing warmth she felt whenever the Duke's attention found hers across a crowded room, against the careful, honest conversations that had slowly begun replacing the cold formality of their earliest encounters. She did not know, not yet, where this fragile, uncertain thing building between them might lead, or whether the distance separating a duke from a household companion could ever truly be crossed without consequence. But she knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that she was no longer the frightened girl who had once fled a humiliating ballroom in tears. She was a woman who had rebuilt her own life from nothing, who had learned to stand steady in the face of cruelty and disappointment alike. And if the Duke's growing warmth toward her proved genuine, she intended to meet it not with the desperate hope of a girl seeking rescue, but with the clear-eyed caution of someone who understood, better than most, exactly how much a careless word could cost. Whatever came next, she promised herself once again, she would meet it as an equal or she would not meet it at all. The summons came from his uncle on a morning when Rhys Ashford least wanted to deal with family matters, arriving in the form of a terse letter demanding his presence at the family's London townhouse before the week was out. He knew, before he even opened the envelope fully, what the conversation would concern. It always concerned the same thing these days. His uncle, Lord Gerald Ashford, had appointed himself the guardian of the family's reputation and financial interests ever since Rhys's father had passed, and in the years since, He had grown increasingly vocal about what he considered the Duke's unacceptable delay in securing a suitable marriage. The estate needed an heir, Gerald argued at every opportunity, and more pressingly, the family's finances, strained by years of poor investment decisions made during Rhys's father's tenure, needed the substantial dowry that a proper alliance could provide. "You cannot continue putting this off indefinitely," Gerald said without preamble when Rhys arrived at the townhouse 3 days later, gesturing him into a chair across from his own, without offering so much as a greeting first. "Lady Beatrice Sinclair remains interested, despite your considerable lack of encouragement over the past several months. Her family's fortune would settle every outstanding debt on the estate within a single season. This is not a matter I am willing to let you delay any further." "I have not asked you to arrange anything on my behalf," Rhys said evenly, though a familiar tightness had already begun building behind his ribs, the particular tension that always accompanied conversations with his uncle about duty and obligation, and the many ways he continued to fall short of both. "Someone must arrange something," Gerald snapped. "You show no urgency in the matter yourself. Do you understand the position this family is in? Do you have any real understanding of what will happen if these debts remain unresolved much longer?" "I understand perfectly well," Rhys said, his voice sharpening despite his effort to remain composed. "I have spent the better part of the last 7 years understanding it, Uncle, ever since I inherited this title along with every debt my father accumulated, while pretending our family's finances were sound." "Then act like it," Gerald said. "Lady Beatrice is accomplished, well-connected, and entirely suitable. I fail to see what continues to give you pause." Rhys said nothing for a long moment, though an image rose unbidden in his mind, unwelcome and entirely inconvenient given the conversation at hand. Alara Whitmore standing in a sunlit garden, watching a young boy fumble his way through a game of croquet with a patience and warmth that no arranged marriage of convenience could ever hope to replicate. He pushed the image aside, aware of how absurd it would sound spoken aloud to a man like his uncle, a man who measured worth entirely in terms of dowries and family connections. "I need more time," he said finally. "Time is precisely what this family does not have," Gerald said, his voice rising with frustration. "I have already arranged a dinner for next month, Rhys, an opportunity for you to formally court Lady Beatrice's attention before her family loses patience entirely and looks elsewhere for a suitable match. I expect you to attend, and I expect you to conduct yourself with the seriousness this situation demands." Rhys left the townhouse that afternoon with a familiar weight settling across his shoulders, the same weight he had carried since childhood, the sense that his own preferences, his own happiness, had always ranked well below the family's reputation and financial standing in the calculations that governed every major decision of his life. He thought of his father, cold and demanding even in his final years, always measuring his son's worth against an impossible standard of duty and appearance. He thought of his sister Lucy, whose own happiness had been sacrificed years earlier to a scandal their father had insisted on burying rather than addressing honestly, a wound in their family that had never properly healed. He did not want to think of Alara, given the conversation he had just endured, but found himself unable to push the thought of her aside entirely as his carriage carried him back toward Ashford Manor. Something had shifted in him during their recent conversations, something he had not experienced in longer than he could remember, a genuine warmth and ease in another person's company that had nothing to do with obligation or family expectation. He found himself looking forward to their encounters with an eagerness that unsettled him, given everything his uncle had just made abundantly clear about the direction his life was expected to take. That evening, seeking distraction from the tightness still gripping his chest, he found his way to the gardens behind Ashford Manor, walking the familiar paths without any particular destination in mind, until he came across Combe tending to a bed of roses in the fading evening light. "You look like a man carrying the weight of the entire estate on his shoulders," Combe observed, not looking up from his work as Reese approached. "That would be an accurate description of the afternoon I've had," Reese admitted, settling onto a nearby bench with a tiredness that went beyond the physical. "Your uncle again." "My uncle again," Reese confirmed, pushing the Sinclair match harder than ever. "He's arranged a dinner, apparently, to formalize my courtship of Lady Beatrice, whether I've expressed any genuine interest in the matter or not." Combe was quiet for a moment, continuing his careful work among the roses. "And do you have any genuine interest in the matter?" "None," Reese said, the honesty surprising even himself. "I have met Lady Beatrice on several occasions. She is perfectly pleasant, perfectly accomplished, and I feel absolutely nothing when I am in her company beyond a vague sense of obligation." "Sounds like a fine foundation for a lifetime together," Combe said dryly. Reese allowed himself a small, humorless laugh. "My uncle would say that fondness is a luxury the estate cannot currently afford." "And what would you say?" Reese did not answer immediately, watching the last light of evening fade slowly behind the garden's tall hedges. "I would say," he admitted finally, "that I have recently begun to understand what it might feel like to genuinely look forward to a person's company, rather than simply tolerate it out of obligation. And I find myself reluctant to give that feeling up for a marriage built entirely on financial convenience." Combe glanced up from his work then, something knowing in his expression that suggested he had already guessed the direction of his employer's thoughts. Would this newfound understanding have anything to do with a certain young woman who once sat on that very bench you're occupying now, some months back, after a rather difficult evening? Reese's expression shifted, caught between surprise and something closer to reluctant honesty. "You remember that?" "Hard to forget," Combe said. "She struck me as someone with considerably more strength than most of the guests who passed through that ballroom, Your Grace, if you don't mind me saying so. I understand she's found her feet since then, working for the Fairweather family." "She has," Reese confirmed quietly. "I've had the opportunity to speak with her several times over the past weeks. She is, unlike anyone else I have encountered in this circle, honest in a way that most people in my position have long since abandoned. She called me out on my cruelty that first evening, and she has continued to hold me accountable for it every time we've spoken since, without ever softening the truth to spare my feelings." "Sounds like exactly the kind of person a man like you needs in his life," Combe observed, returning his attention to the roses. "Someone who won't simply agree with everything you say because of the title attached to your name." "She is," Reese agreed. "But my uncle would never accept such a match, Combe. She has no fortune, no title, no family connections that could benefit the estate in any meaningful way. If anything, given her family's recent financial troubles, the match would be seen as beneath the family's standing entirely." "And does that matter to you?" Combe asked, setting down his shears and looking directly at his employer for the first time in their conversation. "More than whatever you feel when you're in her company?" Reese sat with the question for a long moment, watching the garden settle into deepening shadow around them. He thought of his father's voice, cold and demanding, insisting that duty always outweighed personal desire, that appearance and reputation mattered more than any individual happiness. He thought of the years he had spent building walls around himself precisely to avoid the vulnerability of caring for anyone too deeply, only to find those walls crumbling, slowly and without his permission, every time Alara Whitmore looked at him with that steady, unflinching honesty that no one else in his life had ever offered him. "I don't know yet," he admitted finally, the honesty costing him more than he expected. "But I find myself, for the first time in longer than I can remember, genuinely uncertain about what path forward is the right one. That uncertainty alone tells me something important, I think." "Sounds to me," Combe said, gathering his tools as the last light faded from the garden entirely, "like a man who already knows the answer, but isn't quite ready to say it out loud yet." Reese did not respond, but he sat alone on that bench for a long while after Combe had gone, turning the events of the past several months over in his mind. The humiliation he had caused in a crowded ballroom, the unexpected grace with which Alara had confronted him about it since, the growing warmth he could no longer deny building steadily between them despite every obstacle society had placed in their path. He did not yet know how he would navigate the coming weeks, the dinner his uncle had arranged with Lady Beatrice, the mounting pressure to secure the family's finances through a marriage of convenience rather than genuine feeling. But he knew, sitting alone in that quiet garden as darkness settled fully around him, that something fundamental had shifted within him since that terrible evening months earlier, and that whatever path he chose going forward, he could no longer pretend that duty alone was reason enough to ignore it. News of the Duke's upcoming courtship dinner with Lady Beatrice Sinclair reached the Fairweather estate within days, carried, as such things always were, through the efficient channels of servant gossip and social correspondence that moved faster than any formal announcement ever could. "They say Lord Gerald has all but arranged the match already," Lady Fairweather mentioned over breakfast one morning, addressing her husband while Alara sat at the far end of the table, her attention fixed rather too intently on the plate in front of her. "Lady Beatrice's family stands to gain a great deal from the alliance, and the Ashford estate, from what I understand, is not in the position to be particular about matters of genuine affection." "Sensible enough from a practical standpoint," Lord Fairweather said, unaware of the way Alara's fork had gone still in her hand. "Ashford has put off marriage longer than most men in his position would dare. Can't say I'm surprised his uncle has finally forced the issue." Alara excused herself from the table shortly after, citing a need to prepare the morning's lessons, and made her way to the small study where she conducted her tutoring sessions with a composure that felt increasingly difficult to maintain. She told herself, walking the familiar corridor with her arms wrapped tightly around a stack of books she barely registered carrying, that the news should not affect her nearly as much as it did. She had known, from the very beginning of whatever strange, cautious understanding had been building between herself and the Duke, that the distance separating them remained vast and largely uncrossable. A Duke needed a wife with fortune and connections, not a household companion whose own family had recently collapsed into financial ruin. And yet the news landed like a physical blow, settling heavy and cold in her chest as she sat alone in the empty study, staring at nothing in particular, waiting for Grace and Oliver to arrive for their morning lessons. She did not see the Duke again for nearly 2 weeks following that breakfast conversation, though she told herself the absence meant nothing, that he was simply occupied with the demands of his uncle's arranged courtship, that whatever warmth had grown between them during their recent conversations had always been destined to fade once the practical realities of his position reasserted themselves. The dinner itself, she learned through the same efficient channels of gossip that had first brought her the news, proceeded exactly as Lord Gerald had planned, with Lady Beatrice Sinclair seated at the Duke's right hand throughout the evening, the beginnings of a formal courtship acknowledged, if not yet fully announced, before an audience of the family's closest connections. Alara told herself she was not disappointed. She told herself repeatedly, in the quiet hours after the children had gone to bed, that this outcome had always been the most likely one, that she had known from the very beginning not to invest too much hope in something that society had never intended to allow. But the lie grew harder to maintain each time she caught herself staring out the window of her small room, remembering the warmth in his eyes during their conversation in the garden, the genuine vulnerability of his admissions about his father, about the walls he had built around himself over years of loneliness. She was still turning these thoughts over, alone in the garden of the Fairweather estate on a quiet afternoon nearly 3 weeks after the courtship dinner, when a carriage arrived unannounced, bearing a crest that made her stomach drop the moment she recognized it. The Duke stepped down from the carriage looking considerably less composed than she had ever seen him, his usually immaculate appearance slightly disheveled, as though he had traveled in some haste rather than with his customary careful deliberation. "Miss Whitmore," he crossed the garden toward her with quick, purposeful strides, "I need to speak with you." Alara rose from the bench where she had been sitting, wariness and something closer to hope warring in her chest despite her best efforts to remain guarded. "Your Grace, I understand congratulations may soon be in order, given recent events." Something flashed across his face, frustration perhaps, or genuine hurt at the coolness in her tone. "There is nothing to congratulate. My uncle arranged that dinner without my full consent, and I have made no formal commitment to Lady Beatrice, despite what the gossip circulating through every drawing room in the county might suggest." "And yet you attended," Alara said, unable to entirely keep the edge from her voice. "You sat beside her all evening, from what I understand, and offered no objection to the arrangement." "I attended because my uncle threatened to withhold the funds needed to address the estate's most pressing debts if I refused," Rhys said, his voice carrying a rawness she had not heard from him before. "I sat beside her because refusing to do so publicly would have humiliated a woman who has done nothing to deserve that treatment, whatever my own feelings about the match may be. But I have not agreed to marry her, Alara, and I do not intend to, whatever pressure my uncle continues to apply." Alara studied him carefully, weighing the sincerity of his words against the very real practical obstacles that still stood between them, obstacles that had not disappeared simply because he had traveled here to say them aloud. "Your Grace, even if what you say is true, even if you have no intention of marrying Lady Beatrice, the reality of your position remains unchanged. Your family needs the financial security a match like that could provide. I have no fortune to offer, no family connections that could ease the estate's difficulties. Whatever you feel, whatever I feel in return, does that not remain an insurmountable obstacle?" "I have spent my entire life," Rhys said, stepping closer, his voice low and urgent, "measuring every decision against what my father would have wanted, what my uncle demands, what my title obligates me to prioritize above all else. I have built an entire existence around the belief that duty must always outweigh genuine feeling, that vulnerability is a weakness I cannot afford to indulge. And in the month since I first spoke with you, truly spoke with you, not as a duke addressing a stranger beneath his station, but as one person to another, I have begun to question whether that belief has cost me more than it has ever protected." Alara felt her carefully maintained composure beginning to waver, the weeks of quiet grief and disappointment she had carried since first hearing news of the courtship dinner rising unbidden to the surface. "You cannot simply decide to abandon your family's expectations because of a few pleasant conversations in a garden, Rhys. There are real consequences to the choices you're describing, debts that need settling, an estate that depends on your decisions for its survival." "I know that," he said, and something in his voice cracked slightly, revealing the exhaustion beneath his determination. "I have thought of little else since my uncle first arranged that dinner. I do not have a solution yet, Alara. I do not know how to reconcile what I feel for you with the very real obligations I carry as Duke of Ashford. But I could not continue forward with Lady Beatrice, could not continue pretending that a marriage of pure convenience was an acceptable path, without first telling you the truth of what I feel, whatever that truth ultimately costs either of us." Silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant sound of the children's laughter drifting from somewhere further in the garden, where they played under the watchful eye of another member of the household staff. Alara studied his face, searching for the calculation, the performance she had once assumed defined everything about him, and found instead only raw, uncertain honesty, the expression of a man who had spent his entire life avoiding exactly this kind of vulnerability and had chosen, despite every instinct telling him otherwise, to offer it to her regardless. "What do you want from me, Rhys?" she asked finally, her voice quieter than she intended. "What is it you're actually asking?" "I don't know yet," he admitted. "I don't have a plan, Alara. I don't have a solution to the very real obstacles standing between us." I only know that I could not let another week pass, could not let my uncle push me further toward a marriage I do not want, without first telling you that whatever this is between us, whatever has grown out of a terrible first meeting and every honest conversation since, it matters to me more than I know how to properly express. Alara felt tears gathering unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes, an overwhelming rush of emotion she had spent weeks carefully suppressing finally breaking through the surface. I have spent months telling myself not to hope for anything beyond friendship between us, she admitted. Telling myself that the distance between a duke and a household companion could never truly be crossed, however genuine the feeling on either side. It felt safer, somehow, to expect nothing at all than to hope for something I believed impossible. And now, Rhys asked, closing the remaining distance between them with careful, deliberate steps, what do you believe now? Alara looked up at him, at the raw sincerity still visible in his expression, and found herself, despite every reasonable objection her mind could still construct, unwilling to continue pretending that her own feelings did not exist as powerfully as his. Now, she said quietly, I believe that whatever obstacles remain between us, I would rather face them honestly together than continue pretending I feel nothing simply because feeling something is inconvenient. Something in Rhys's expression shifted then, relief and hope mingling with an intensity that made Alara's breath catch. He reached for her hand gently, giving her every opportunity to pull away if she wished, and when she did not, he held it carefully between both of his own, as though it were something precious he had not expected to be given permission to touch. I do not know what the coming weeks will hold, he said quietly. My uncle will not accept this easily, and there will be difficult conversations ahead, decisions that may cost more than either of us would like. But I do not want to continue building my life around obligation alone, Alara. Not anymore. Not when I have finally found someone, worth choosing over duty for the first time in my entire life. Then we will face whatever comes together, Alara said, her voice steadier now, strengthened by the same quiet resolve that had carried her through every difficult chapter of her life since that terrible evening at his ball. But Rhys, I need you to understand something clearly. I will not be a secret you hide from your family out of convenience, nor a consolation you settle for once every other option has been exhausted. If we do this, if we choose each other despite everything standing in our way, it must be honest and it must be equal. I have spent too long being treated as something less than worthy. I will not accept that treatment again from anyone, regardless of the title attached to their name. I would not ask that of you, Rhys said, his voice firm with a conviction that settled something uncertain in Alara's chest. You have shown me, more clearly than anyone else in my entire life, exactly what genuine worth looks like, Alara. I do not intend to forget that lesson, whatever obstacles my uncle or society at large chooses to place in our path. They stood together in the quiet garden for a long while after that, the weight of everything still unresolved between them settling into something that felt, despite every remaining uncertainty, like the beginning of genuine hope rather than the familiar disappointment Alara had grown accustomed to expecting from the world around her. She did not know, not yet, how the coming weeks would unfold, what battles still waited ahead with Lord Gerald and the family's mounting financial pressures, what price either of them might ultimately pay for choosing honesty over convenience. But for the first time since that terrible night in the ballroom, watching her father laugh while a stranger declared her unworthy, Alara Whitmore allowed herself to believe, fully and without reservation, that she might finally be standing at the beginning of a story where her own worth was never in question at all. The trouble began, as trouble so often did in circles governed by reputation and inheritance, with a rumor whispered in the wrong drawing room to the wrong set of ears. Someone, Alara never learned exactly who, had witnessed the Duke's carriage arriving unannounced at the Fairweather estate, had noted the length of his visit, had drawn conclusions from the careful distance he and Alara now maintained in public that nonetheless failed to fully disguise the warmth that had grown between them. Within a fortnight, the rumor had traveled far enough to reach Lord Gerald himself, arriving at his townhouse in the form of a carefully worded letter from an acquaintance eager to share news of the Duke's apparent infatuation with a household companion of no fortune or standing. Lord Gerald arrived at Ashford Manor without warning on a grey morning that matched perfectly the storm about to break over the household, finding his nephew in the study reviewing estate accounts with an outward calm that did nothing to prepare him for the fury waiting on the other side of the door. "Tell me this is not true," Gerald said without preamble, closing the study door firmly behind him. "Tell me you have not been carrying on with some governess while Lady Beatrice's family waits in good faith for a formal proposal." Rhys set down his pen carefully, meeting his uncle's furious gaze without flinching. "Her name is Alara Whitmore, and I have not been carrying on with anyone, uncle. We have spoken, on several occasions." "That is all." "That is more than enough," Gerald snapped, crossing the room to loom over the desk with an intensity Rhys had rarely seen from him. "Do you have any understanding of what this family stands to lose if the Sinclair match falls through now, after everything I have already arranged? Do you understand the debts still hanging over this estate, debts that a marriage to some penniless companion will do absolutely nothing to address?" "I understand the debts perfectly well," Rhys said, his own voice hardening. "I have understood them since the day I inherited this title, uncle, and I have spent 7 years making decisions in service of resolving them, often at considerable personal cost. I am not asking you to ignore the family's financial situation. I am telling you that I will not marry a woman I feel nothing for simply because her family's fortune happens to be convenient." "Feelings," Gerald said the word with open contempt, "are a luxury this family cannot afford, Rhys. Your father understood that better than anyone. Duty comes first. It has always come first for every generation of this family that came before you, and it will continue to come first for every generation that follows, whether you find that inconvenient or not. My father's understanding of duty left him cold and alone, uncle, estranged from his own children, incapable of offering either myself or Lucy a single moment of genuine warmth in the years before his death. I do not intend to follow that same path simply because it is familiar." Gerald's expression darkened further at the mention of Lucy, an old wound that clearly still carried considerable weight between them. "Your sister's difficulties are not relevant to this conversation." "They are entirely relevant," Rhys said, rising from his chair to meet his uncle's gaze directly, "because they demonstrate precisely what happens when this family prioritizes appearance and duty over genuine care for the people within it. I will not repeat that mistake, uncle, not with my own life, and certainly not by treating Miss Whitmore's feelings, or my own, as inconvenient obstacles to be managed rather than genuine considerations worth respecting." The confrontation ended without resolution, Gerald storming from the study with a final, furious warning that the family would not simply stand aside and watch the Ashford name diminished by an unsuitable match, that he would take whatever measures necessary to protect the estate's interests, whatever those measures ultimately required. Alara learned of the confrontation 2 days later, when Lady Fairweather called her into the private sitting room with an expression that immediately signaled trouble. "I received a letter this morning," Lady Fairweather said carefully, "from a woman closely connected to Lord Gerald's household. It seems the Duke's uncle has taken considerable exception to the rumors circulating about your friendship with the Duke, Alara, and I'm afraid he has not limited his displeasure to private conversations within his own family." Alara felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. What has he done? "He has written to several families within our social circle," Lady Fairweather said, her expression tight with barely restrained anger on Alara's behalf, "suggesting that you have deliberately pursued the Duke's attention despite your unsuitable station, implying rather strongly that your conduct has been calculated and inappropriate. I do not believe a word of it, of course, but I'm afraid such rumors, once released into circulation, prove remarkably difficult to contain." The full weight of the situation settled over Alara slowly in the days that followed, as invitations to social gatherings that had previously included her began quietly disappearing, as the warm greetings she had grown accustomed to receiving from acquaintances in the Fairweathers circle cooled into careful, distant politeness. She had fought so hard to build a life of dignity and independence after leaving her father's house, had taken genuine pride in the position she had earned through her own effort and character, and watching that hard-won respectability crumble under the weight of Lord Gerald's carefully orchestrated rumors felt like watching months of careful work dissolve into nothing. Worse news arrived less than a week later, in the form of a letter from her Aunt Margaret, carrying news that made the ground beneath Alara feel even less stable than it already had. "Your father has fallen further into debt," the letter read, "since the failed shipping venture, and Edmund Voss has grown considerably less patient about the marriage arrangement that never came to pass. He has threatened legal action to recover certain funds your father borrowed against the promise of that match, and I fear the situation has grown genuinely dangerous. Your father asks, with what little pride he has left, whether there is any possibility you might reconsider the arrangement now, given how dire matters have become." Alara sat with the letter for a long time after reading it, feeling the walls of her carefully constructed independence closing in from every direction at once. Lord Gerald's rumors threatened the respectable position she had built with the Fairweathers. Her father's renewed desperation threatened to drag her back into the very arrangement she had fled months earlier. And somewhere beneath both of those pressing concerns lay the quieter, more painful fear that her growing feelings for Rhys, feelings she had only recently allowed herself to fully acknowledge, might ultimately cost him far more than she was willing to let him sacrifice on her behalf. She found Rhys again 3 days later, when he arrived at the Fairweather estate for what had become a familiar, if increasingly complicated, pattern of stolen conversations in the garden. She could see immediately, from the tension visible in his posture, that he had already heard something of his uncle's campaign against her reputation. "I am so sorry," he said before she could speak at all, crossing the garden toward her with an urgency that suggested he had rehearsed this conversation many times on the journey over. "My uncle's behavior is inexcusable, Alara, and I intend to address it directly, whatever the cost to my relationship with him." "It is not only your uncle's rumors I am contending with," Alara said quietly, and found herself, despite every intention to remain composed, unable to keep the exhaustion from her voice as she explained her father's renewed pressure, Edmund Voss's threats of legal action, the mounting weight of obligations that seemed determined to pull her back into a life she had fought so hard to escape. Rhys listened in silence, his expression growing increasingly troubled as she spoke. "Then let me help," he said when she finished. "I have resources, Alara. I could settle your father's debts, could ensure Voss no longer has any claim over your family's circumstances." "No," the word came out sharper than Alara intended, though she did not soften it. "I will not have you buy my father's freedom from debt as though it were some transaction, Rhys, some price paid to secure my own hand in return. I left that house specifically to escape being treated as a bargaining chip in someone else's financial arrangement. I will not walk into a different version of the very same trap simply because the terms happen to be kinder this time." "That is not what I intended," Rhys said, though something in his expression suggested her words had landed with genuine weight. "I only wanted to help ease a burden that should never have fallen on your shoulders in the first place." "I know," Alara said, softening slightly, though the tension in her chest remained. "And I am grateful for the offer, truly. But Rhys, I need to resolve this on my own terms, in my own way, or accepting your help will only prove Lord Gerald right about everything he has said about me. I do not want to be seen, by you or by anyone else, as someone who attached herself to a duke's fortune the moment her own circumstances grew difficult." Rhys studied her for a long moment, something like admiration mingling with obvious frustration in his expression. "You are the most stubbornly independent person I have ever encountered, Alara Whitmore." "I have had to be," she said simply. It is the only way I have ever known to keep my dignity intact." They stood together in the garden a while longer, discussing the mounting pressures from every direction with a careful honesty that had become the foundation of whatever they were building together, though neither of them arrived at any clear solution before Reese was forced to depart, called back to Ashford Manor by pressing estate business that could not be further delayed. Alara returned to her small room that evening with the weight of everything unresolved settling heavily across her shoulders. She thought of her father, desperate and frightened, reaching out for her help despite months of near silence between them. She thought of Lord Gerald's rumors, slowly eroding the respectable position she had worked so hard to build. She thought of Reese, caught between family obligation and genuine feeling, fighting battles on her behalf that she had not asked him to fight and was not entirely certain she wanted him fighting. She did not sleep well that night, turning the tangled threads of her situation over and over in her mind, searching for some path forward that did not require sacrificing either her independence or the fragile, precious thing growing between herself and Reese. She thought more than once of simply walking away entirely, of writing to her aunt and explaining that the complications had grown too great, that perhaps it would be simpler for everyone involved if she quietly removed herself from a situation that seemed determined to hurt everyone connected to it. But even as the thought formed, she recognized it for what it was, the same old fear that had once sent her fleeing from a humiliating ballroom, the same instinct to make herself smaller rather than face difficulty head-on. She had promised herself, in the quiet aftermath of that terrible evening months ago, that she would never again let fear dictate the shape of her choices. She did not intend to break that promise now, however dark the path ahead appeared. Whatever came next, whatever battles remained to be fought against Lord Gerald's rumors, her father's desperation, and the vast gulf of station that still separated a duke from a household companion, Alara resolved, lying awake in the darkness of her small room, that she would meet them the same way she had met every difficulty since that night at Ashford Manor, standing, unbroken, and entirely unwilling to let anyone else determine her own worth. The solution, when it finally arrived, came not from Reese's fortune or Lord Gerald's grudging cooperation, but from Alara's own resourcefulness, born of months spent learning to navigate difficulty entirely on her own terms. She wrote to Edmund Voss directly, a letter composed over several careful drafts, laying out in plain terms that she would not be marrying him under any circumstances, that her father's debts were her father's responsibility rather than an obligation that could be transferred onto her through marriage, and that any legal action he pursued against her family would be met with equally determined resistance, including a full public accounting of the manner in which he had attempted to purchase a wife through the settlement of another man's debts. She had learned enough, in her time working within the Fairweather household, about the delicate nature of reputation among men like Voss to understand that the threat of public scrutiny carried weight of its own, regardless of the legal merits of his claims. She followed this with a visit to her father himself, the first time she had returned to her childhood home since the morning she departed for the Fairweather estate. She found him thinner, grayer, considerably humbled by months of mounting financial pressure, and something in his defeated posture stirred a complicated mixture of lingering resentment and reluctant sympathy within her. "I did not come to forgive you," she told him plainly, seated across from him in the same cold study where he had once informed her of the family's ruin. "I came because Aunt Margaret asked me to, and because despite everything, you remain my father. But I will not marry Edmund Voss, and I will not allow you to sell my future to settle debts you accumulated through your own poor judgment. If you wish to resolve this situation, you will need to find another path, one that does not require sacrificing your daughter's life to do it." Her father, chastened by months of hardship in a way that no amount of argument had achieved before, finally seemed to hear her, perhaps for the first time in either of their lives. "I am sorry, Alara," he said quietly, the words carrying a weight of genuine regret she had not expected to hear from him. "I have been a poor father to you, particularly since your mother passed. I let my own fears about our family's standing outweigh any real consideration for your happiness, and I see now, far too late, the cost that decision has carried. It was not the full reckoning Alara might once have hoped for, not the complete transformation of a man who had spent her entire life prioritizing appearance over genuine care. But it was honest, and it was a beginning, and Alara found, sitting in that familiar cold study, that she was willing to accept it as such, even if full trust between them would take considerably longer to rebuild. With Voss's legal claims weakened by the threat of public exposure and her father finally willing to negotiate a more modest repayment arrangement with his remaining creditors, the most immediate crisis threatening Alara's family began slowly to resolve itself, though not without considerable remaining difficulty and the lingering damage of months spent under threat. Lord Gerald's rumors proved a more stubborn obstacle, one that Rhys ultimately addressed through a direct confrontation. Alara only learned the full details of much later. He informed his uncle, in terms that left no room for negotiation, that he intended to pursue a relationship with Alara Whitmore regardless of family objection, that he would rather forfeit whatever financial advantage the Sinclair match might have provided than continue building his entire life around obligations that brought him no genuine happiness. He reminded his uncle, pointedly, of the cost their family had already paid for prioritizing appearance over authentic care, invoking Lucy's old, painful scandal in a manner that finally seemed to give Gerald genuine pause. The confrontation did not end with Gerald's full approval, not immediately. But it did end with a grudging agreement to cease actively spreading rumors intended to damage Alara's reputation, along with a reluctant acknowledgement that the Duke's own happiness, however inconvenient to the family's financial calculations, might carry weight worth considering after all. It was in this fragile, uncertain calm that the invitation arrived for the Ashford family's annual autumn ball, the same grand social event, held in the same magnificent ballroom, where Alara had once approached the Duke with a trembling curtsy and received in return a public humiliation that had reshaped the entire course of her life. "You do not have to attend," Lady Fairweather said gently when the invitation arrived at the Fairweather estate several weeks later. "Given everything that room represents for you, Alara, I would understand entirely if you preferred to remain here." But Alara found, turning the invitation over in her hands, that she felt no fear at the prospect this time, only a quiet, steady determination to walk back into that ballroom not as the frightened girl who had once fled it in humiliation, but as exactly who she had become in the months since, independent, resilient, and entirely certain of her own worth, regardless of what any room full of strangers might think of her. "I will attend," she said finally, meeting Lady Fairweather's gaze with steady resolve. "I have nothing left to fear in that room, my lady. I intend to walk into it exactly as I am." The night of the ball arrived with the same golden candlelight, the same gleaming marble floors, the same crowd of titled guests that had once made Alara feel impossibly small and out of place. But this time, dressed in a gown of deep blue silk that Lady Fairweather had commissioned specifically for the occasion, her posture steady and her chin lifted with genuine confidence rather than nervous determination, Alara moved through the crowd feeling entirely unlike the frightened young woman who had once crossed this same floor with trembling hands. She spotted Rhys near the center of the room almost immediately, his gaze finding hers across the crowded space with an intensity that drew more than a few curious glances from the surrounding guests, well aware by now, through the persistent efficiency of gossip, of the connection rumored to exist between the Duke and the household companion who had once suffered such public humiliation within these very walls. He crossed the room toward her without hesitation, ignoring the murmurs that followed his path, and stopped before her with a formal bow that carried none of the coldness of their first encounter. "Miss Whitmore." His voice carried clearly enough that the nearby guests, several of whom had likely witnessed or heard tell of their first meeting, could not help but overhear. "Would you do me the very great honor of a dance?" The room fell silent around them, the same particular hush that had once accompanied his cruel dismissal months earlier, though this time, Alara noted, the silence carried anticipation rather than cruel amusement. She glanced across the room and found her father standing near the refreshment table, having been invited that evening as a guest in his own right for the first time in months, his expression a mixture of astonishment and something that looked remarkably like shame as he watched the scene unfold before him. "I would be honored, Your Grace," Alara said, her voice carrying clearly across the hushed ballroom, steady and sure in a way that stood in stark, deliberate contrast to the trembling request she had once made in this same space. Rhys led her onto the dance floor as the orchestra began to play, and for a moment, standing at the center of the room with every eye fixed upon them, Alara allowed herself to simply exist in the moment, feeling the weight of every difficult month since that first humiliating evening settle into something that finally felt, for the first time, like genuine triumph rather than mere survival. "You once told me," Rhys said quietly as they began to move together across the polished floor, "that my honesty that first evening taught you a great deal about the value of a title. I find myself hoping tonight might teach you something rather different." "And what would that be, Your Grace?" "That worth was never determined by title at all," he said, his gaze steady on hers as they moved through the familiar steps of the dance, "but by the strength of character a person carries within them, regardless of what circumstance or cruelty tries to convince them otherwise. I was a fool not to recognize that the very first time we met, Alara. I do not intend to remain a fool about it any longer." Alara felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, though she blinked them back, unwilling to let anything dim the quiet triumph of this particular moment. "You have grown, Rhys, since that first evening, more than I think either of us expected possible." "I had considerable help," he said, a genuine warmth in his expression that had nothing to do with performance or duty. "From a woman who refused to let my cruelty define either of us, and who taught me, through nothing but her own quiet resilience, exactly what genuine strength looks like." As the dance continued, drawing the attention of nearly every guest in the crowded ballroom, Alara caught sight of her father once more, standing frozen near the refreshment table, his earlier amusement entirely replaced now by something that looked remarkably like humility. He did not laugh this time. He simply watched, silent and visibly humbled, as his daughter moved through the crowded floor not as a bargaining chip offered up for his own benefit, but as a woman entirely capable of commanding a room through nothing but her own quiet, hard-won dignity. When the music finally ended, Rhys did not release her hand immediately, holding it instead with a gentle, deliberate care that drew soft murmurs of interest from the watching crowd. "Alara Whitmore," he said, his voice carrying just enough to reach the ears of those standing nearest, though pitched primarily for her alone, "I do not intend to let station or family obligation determine the shape of my happiness any longer. I would like, very much, to court you properly, publicly, and without any of the shame or secrecy that has surrounded whatever understanding has grown between us these past months. Would you allow me that honor?" The ballroom seemed to hold its breath around them, guests leaning in with poorly disguised curiosity, waiting for her answer with an intensity that might once have overwhelmed the frightened girl who had fled this very room in tears. But Alara, standing steady and unafraid at the center of the same floor where she had once been declared unworthy, felt nothing but quiet, certain joy as she considered his question. "I would be honored, Your Grace," she said, loud enough for the surrounding crowd to hear clearly, "to be courted by a man who has finally learned, through considerable effort, the true meaning of worth." The murmur that spread through the crowd carried a different quality than the amused whispers that had once accompanied her humiliation, something closer to genuine surprise, and from more than a few quarters, quiet admiration for the resilience she had shown in transforming that same room from the site of her deepest humiliation into the setting for her clearest triumph. Her father approached slowly once the dance had concluded, his expression carrying none of the confident bluster that had once characterized nearly every interaction between them. "Alara," he said quietly, standing before her with visible uncertainty for perhaps the first time in her entire memory of him. "I owe you an apology far greater than the one I offered weeks ago. I laughed that night when I should have defended you. I have thought of that failure every single day since, and I am deeply sorry for the pain it caused you." Alara studied her father's face for a long moment, searching for the sincerity beneath his words, and found, to her genuine surprise, something that looked remarkably like true remorse rather than mere convenient regret. "Thank you for saying that, father," she said finally. "It does not erase what happened. But it matters that you can finally see it clearly. I am proud of you," he added, his voice catching slightly on the words, "for everything you have built since that night entirely on your own without any help from me. I do not know that I deserve to say that, given how little support I offered you along the way, but I am proud of you nonetheless." It was not the complete resolution Alara might once have hoped for in some earlier, more naive version of herself, but it was honest, and it was more than she had expected to receive, and she found, standing in that ballroom surrounded by the wreckage and triumph of everything the past several months had brought her, that it was enough. The rest of the evening passed in a warm blur of dances and careful conversation, of curious guests approaching to offer congratulations they would not have dreamed of extending months earlier, of Lady Fairweather watching from across the room with an expression of quiet, proud satisfaction that mirrored something Alara felt growing steadily within her own chest. By the time the carriage carried her back toward the Fairweather estate late that evening, the ballroom's golden light fading slowly behind her into the darkness of the countryside road, Alara found herself reflecting on the extraordinary distance she had traveled since that first terrible evening in Ashford Manor's grand ballroom. She had arrived that night a frightened girl, valued only for what she might secure for her father's ambitions, dismissed by a cold duke who had looked at her with nothing but contempt. She left this night an entirely different woman, one who had built her own life from nothing, who had learned the true measure of her own worth through hardship rather than inheritance, and who had finally found, in the most unexpected of places, a partner capable of matching that hard-won strength with genuine honesty and respect of his own. Whatever challenges still remained ahead, whatever further battles Lord Gerald or society at large might yet wage against their unlikely match, Alara felt entirely confident, for the first time since that terrible evening months earlier, that she possessed exactly the strength required to meet them. Winter settled over the countryside in the weeks following the autumn ball, bringing with it a cold, clean quiet that Alara found she welcomed after months of turmoil, each frosted morning offering a fresh reminder that even the harshest seasons eventually gave way to something gentler. Her courtship with Rhys continued through those winter months with a steadiness that surprised even her, built not on secret garden conversations any longer but on open, public visits that carried none of the shame or caution that had once shadowed their earliest meetings. He called on her regularly at the Fairweather estate, always with proper notice, always with the full knowledge and blessing of Lord and Lady Fairweather, who had grown genuinely fond of watching the careful, respectful affection grow between the two of them. Lord Gerald remained a difficult presence throughout those months. Never entirely reconciled to a match he continued to view as beneath the family's proper standing, but the public nature of Rhys's declaration at the autumn ball had left him with considerably less room to maneuver against them through whispered rumor and quiet manipulation. He retreated instead into a grudging, cold tolerance, offering neither warmth nor further active opposition, content, it seemed, to simply wait and see whether the match would eventually collapse under its own impracticality. It did not. If anything, the months of winter only deepened the understanding between Alara and Rhys, each visit revealing new layers of the person beneath the careful exteriors they had both once used to protect themselves from a world that had shown neither of them much genuine kindness. Alara learned of his sister Lucy's story in full during one particularly cold evening spent by the fireplace at Ashford Manor, invited now as an honored guest rather than a stranger seeking a single dance. She fell in love with a man our father considered entirely unsuitable, Reese explained, watching the fire rather than meeting Alara's eyes as he spoke. A merchant's son, educated and kind, but without title or the fortune our father demanded of any potential match for his daughter. Father forbade the relationship entirely, forced Lucy into a marriage with a viscount twice her age instead, a man who treated her with the same cold distance our father had always shown the rest of us. She was miserable for years, Alara, trapped in a marriage that offered nothing but suffering, simply because our father valued appearance and title over any genuine consideration of her happiness. Is she happy now? Alara asked gently. Her husband passed 2 years ago, Reese said. She has found some measure of peace since then, though I do not think the scars of those years will ever fully fade. I think of her often, Alara, when I consider what almost happened between us, had I allowed my uncle to push me into a marriage of pure convenience rather than genuine feeling. I could not do to myself, or to you, what our father did to Lucy. I would not survive watching either of us become as hollow as she became during those difficult years. Alara reached for his hand across the small space between their chairs, understanding, more fully now than ever, the depth of courage his choice had required, the weight of family history he had carried into every conversation between them since their very first meeting. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for choosing differently, for both our sakes." Spring arrived gradually, thawing the frost from the countryside, and bringing with it a lightness that seemed to mirror the steady progress of Alara's own circumstances. Her father, chastened by months of genuine hardship and the slow, difficult work of rebuilding trust with his daughter, had begun to show signs of real change, taking on modest work as a clerk for a merchant house in the city rather than continuing to gamble on speculative ventures that had once nearly destroyed their family entirely. Their relationship remained far from what it might have been under kinder circumstances, but Alara found, visiting him occasionally through the early months of spring, that she no longer carried the same bitter weight of resentment that had once defined every interaction between them. Edmund Voss, faced with the reality that his legal claims carried little weight and considerably more risk to his own reputation than he had initially anticipated, quietly withdrew his threats entirely, disappearing from Alara's life with the same abruptness that had once made his presence feel so threatening. She heard, months later, second-hand through the same efficient channels of gossip that carried most news through their circle, that he had eventually pursued a more conventional business arrangement, with a family considerably more eager for the match than her own had ever been. It was in early summer, nearly a full year after that first disastrous evening at Ashford Manor, that Reese arrived at the Fairweather estate on a warm, golden afternoon, with a formality in his manner that immediately caught Alara's attention. "You look nervous," she observed, watching him from her seat in the garden, the same garden where they had shared so many of their earliest, most honest conversations. "I am considerably nervous," he admitted, settling onto the bench beside her with less than his usual composed grace. "I have something I wish to ask you, Alara, and I confess I have rehearsed the words more times than I would care to admit." Alara felt her heart begin to race, though she kept her expression carefully neutral, waiting for him to continue. "Then perhaps you should simply say them, rather than continue rehearsing." Reese laughed softly, some of the tension easing from his shoulders at her gentle teasing. "You are right, as you so often are." He reached into his coat and withdrew a small velvet box, opening it to reveal a ring set with a single, modest stone, elegant rather than ostentatious, chosen, Alara suspected, with careful consideration of exactly the kind of woman she had shown herself to be. "Alara Whitmore, I have spent the past year learning, through your example more than anything else, what genuine worth actually means. You taught me that a title means nothing without character to support it, that cruelty leaves scars that titles cannot heal, and that the truest measure of a person lies in how they meet hardship rather than what fortune they inherit. I would be honored, more than I know how to properly express, if you would agree to become my wife." Alara looked at the ring, then at his face, at the genuine vulnerability written so plainly across features that had once seemed carved from cold stone, and felt the full weight of the past year's journey settle into something that finally, entirely, felt like joy without reservation. "Yes," she said simply, her voice steady despite the tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. "Yes, Rhys, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly, and when he pulled her into an embrace, Alara felt, for the first time in longer than she could properly remember, the complete absence of any doubt about her own worth, about her place in the world, about the value of everything she had fought so hard to build for herself in the months since that terrible first ballroom encounter. The wedding took place in early autumn, exactly 1 year after the evening that had first brought them together through such painful circumstances, held not at the grand ballroom of Ashford Manor, but in the small, sunlit chapel near the Fairweather estate, surrounded by a modest gathering of the people who had genuinely supported Alara through every difficult chapter of the preceding year. Lady Fairweather stood proudly among the guests, having become something like family to Alara over the course of her employment. Colm attended as well, invited personally by Rhys, standing quietly near the back of the chapel with an expression of genuine, satisfied warmth as he watched the young woman he had once comforted in a moonlit garden take her place at the altar beside the man she had once believed incapable of genuine kindness. Even Lord Gerald attended, his presence carrying a grudging acceptance rather than genuine enthusiasm, though Alara noted, watching him from the altar, that something in his rigid posture had softened slightly over the preceding months, as though the evidence of Rhys's genuine happiness had finally begun to chip away at his old convictions about duty and appearance mattering more than authentic care. Her father walked her down the short aisle of the small chapel, his hand steady beneath her own, his expression carrying a quiet pride that Alara found, to her own surprise, she was finally able to accept without the old bitterness that had once colored every interaction between them. "Your mother would be proud of you," he whispered, as they paused just before reaching the altar where Rhys stood waiting. "I am proud of you, Alara, more than I have ever properly told you." "Thank you, Father," she said, and found in that quiet moment that she meant it entirely. The ceremony itself passed in a warm blur, vows exchanged with genuine feeling rather than the cold formality that so often characterized matches within their social circle. And when Rhys finally kissed her before the small assembled crowd, Alara felt the full weight of everything the past year had brought her, every hardship and humiliation, every quiet act of resilience and hard-won independence, settle into a single, complete moment of belonging that no title or fortune could have ever provided on its own. They did not return to the grand, formal life that Lord Gerald had once envisioned for the Duke's eventual marriage. Instead, Alara and Rhys built something entirely their own within the walls of Ashford Manor, a household that balanced the necessary obligations of his title with a genuine warmth that had been entirely absent during his own childhood there. They welcomed Lucy for extended visits, watching her slowly rebuild her own sense of joy within a household that finally offered the acceptance she had been denied during her father's lifetime. They maintained close ties with the Fairweather family, with Grace and Oliver visiting often enough that Alara continued, in some informal capacity, to remain part of their lives even after her formal employment had ended. And Colm remained head groundskeeper of Ashford Manor's gardens for many years afterward, tending the same roses and oak trees that had once offered quiet comfort to a heartbroken young woman on the worst night of her life. Years later, when their own children grew old enough to ask about how their parents had first met, Alara would tell them the story plainly, without softening the painful parts for the sake of a tidier narrative. She would tell them about a ballroom, and a cruel word spoken too loudly, and a father's careless laughter that had once nearly broken something essential within her. She would tell them about the long, difficult months of rebuilding a life from nothing, of learning to stand steady in the face of hardship rather than waiting for someone else to rescue her from it. And she would tell them always that the most important lesson of that entire difficult year had nothing to do with dukes or titles or grand ballrooms at all, but with the simple, hard-earned understanding that worth was never something other people could grant or withhold through a single cruel sentence, however powerful the person speaking it happened to be. Worth, she would tell her children, watching their young faces absorb the lesson with the particular seriousness of childhood, was something a person carried within themselves, built slowly through every difficult choice to remain honest, resilient, and unwilling to accept anyone else's judgment as the final word on their own value. She had learned that lesson in a moonlit garden, in the quiet kindness of a stranger who tended roses for a living. She had learned it in the steady rhythm of teaching two energetic children their letters and their sums, in the dignity of honest work chosen freely rather than inherited or imposed. She had learned it, most powerfully of all, in the moment she walked back into the very ballroom that had once broken her, and found that the room itself held no power over her any longer, that she had carried her own worth with her the entire time, waiting only to be fully recognized and claimed. The Duke had once told her, cruelly, in front of an entire crowded room, that she was not worthy of a single dance. It had taken an entire year of hardship and quiet courage for both of them to fully understand how wrong those careless words had been, not because a title or a title's approval had finally been granted to her, but because she had never needed anyone's permission to be worthy at all. She had simply needed time and the courage to keep walking forward, to prove it entirely to herself.